Chapter 3. Jack wasn't too worried about people seeing him this time, as he dragged his bag behind him. Most people from the office park were probably gone by now, but even if they did see a cat dragging a bag around, who would bother to do anything about it? Maybe they'd pull out their phone for a snapshot or a video, but no one would bother to chase some stray cat and steal a bag from it if it hadn't stolen the bag from them personally. Jack stuck to the sidewalks where he could. It was easier to drag the bag on pavement than on grass. He did attract stares as he expected, but no one approached him. The route from work to home didn't require any highways, thankfully, since Amherst was a relatively small town. However, he did have to cross a few busy intersections in the business zone near the freeway before he got into the relatively simple four-way stops of the residential areas. Jack navigated confidently, as he regularly walked to and from work rather than wasting money on gas or a gym membership. But seeing the world from his new cat perspective made him pay attention to things he'd never noticed before. Broken glass on the pavement that he now had to avoid. Glimpses into people's yards under their fences and hedges. The looming trees that never seemed quite so looming before. He also began to notice an increasing discomfort. Was he really wearing out that quickly? It hardly felt like a workout. Then the discomfort began to localize a bit. No, it wasn't in his muscles. His legs all felt fine. It was in his core. And now it was in his belly. And now it was in a very particular place in his belly that felt like it was bubbling rapidly down his torso in a very clear, get-to-the-bathroom-fast sort of way. Funny that with such a different body, indigestion felt exactly the same still. But what could he possibly have indigestion from? He had eaten the same lunch dozens of times before without any problem, and Rocky had never seemed uncomfortable after eating Jack's leftover tuna once in a while. His belly gurgled more urgently. The only other thing he had eaten was yogurt. What was wrong with yogurt? Then Jack remembered what his vet had told him. Most cats are lactose intolerant. He cursed his luck and began to panic. He didn't mind people seeing him walking on the street, but if he didn't find somewhere private fast, they'd see him doing a lot more than walking. A hedge up ahead provided just the privacy he needed. He pulled his bag under the bushes and started to dig hastily in the dirt several feet away with his forepaws. This felt so wrong. He positioned himself over the hole and glanced around uncomfortably as he let the discomfort run its course. It was a nasty business. But he felt much better afterward. He scraped loose dirt into the hole and tried to ignore the awkwardness of not having used toilet paper. This poor person's lawn would have to suffice. Disaster averted, Jack fetched his bag and headed back onto the sidewalk. He was feeling much better now, so much so that he forgot all about the house with the invisible fence, 2 corners from his street, until their enthusiastic golden retriever was about halfway across the yard and moving like a bullet. Once again, his new reflexes kicked in, and he was halfway up a tree before he knew what he was doing. He clung to the tree with his claws, heart racing, and looking down at the golden retriever. It was still running back and forth under the tree, leaping up and snapping its jaws and giving quiet, strangled-sounding barks. "Get out of here, you stupid mutt!" Jack yelled, but, of course, it only came out as yowling. Jack had never minded the dog much before. It would race back and forth along its invisible barrier as he walked by, barking that choked bark it had probably developed in order to avoid shocks from the collar that it wore. Jack had always just moved a bit further from the dog's side of the sidewalk and ignored it. But that was when he was at the top of the food chain. Now the dog was registering in the new animal parts of his mind as an apex predator. As his human thought processes kicked back in, Jack identified an even bigger threat. With all his own yowling, and if the dog kept barking like this, its owner might come out to see what the fuss was about, and find Jack's bag with his wallet and phone inside. He couldn't let that happen. So, still hanging from the trunk, he scooted around to the street side of the tree. The branches on this side reached out beyond what he was pretty sure was the line of the invisible fence. Jack gingerly released one of his forepaws and put it onto one of the branches. Though it was just 2 inches in diameter, Jack's paws would fit perfectly on it, as though he were walking on a wide balance beam. With a bit of a scramble and a precarious moment when one of his back feet slipped, Jack managed to perch on the branch and move out towards its end. It sagged dangerously, and the dog whimpered as it kept running back and forth along its radio barrier, desperate to catch Jack. Jack had a clear view down because most of the tree's leaves had already fallen. With a time leaped to maximize the sprinting dog's distance from him when he landed, Jack reached the sidewalk again and hurried to get his bag across to the far side of the street. The dog raced madly up and down the full length of its yard, still unwilling to admit defeat. Jack hissed at the dog for good measure, then hurried on his way. If he could get home before nightfall, he'd probably miss the other cats in his neighborhood, encounters he would rather avoid as long as possible. But there was one encounter he knew he couldn't avoid, and that was with Rocky. Jack was curious. Would he be able to talk with Rocky now in some sort of cat language? Would Rocky attack him before he could even find out? He saw this previously unforeseen hole in his plan growing wider. Was he even going to be able to get into his own house through the cat door? How would he get his work done if Rocky refused even to let him in? As he rounded the corner onto his street, he saw his little one-bedroom, blue aluminum-sided mid-century house and looked for Rocky in the front window. There he was, sitting up in profile with his eyes closed, basking in the final rays of the sunset. Jack felt a surge of affection for the old man as he thought of him. Rocky was a good cat. He had moved with Jack out of his parents' house, upstate New York, after Jack had finished college and gotten this job in Ohio. At 17 years old, Rocky was a lot slower and more stately than he used to be, though he had fared quite well for an indoor-outdoor cat. His parents had had Rocky, who was named for the Rocky Road ice cream his coloring had reminded Jack of, neutered when they adopted him from a shelter. So Jack had never had to figure out what to do with kittens or deal with Rocky going wild during mating season. He only later learned that the rare male tortoiseshell calico is usually sterile anyway. Jack also had never had him declawed, which had probably saved Rocky's life in a few of the violent encounters he'd had with other cats through the years. Now he was a calm old bachelor with a few battle scars and a friendly temperament. He wasn't intrusive or demanding, but he always seemed to enjoy a good head scratch whenever Jack felt like petting him, and would usually stay on his lap purring for at least a few minutes if Jack picked him up. But he wasn't much interested in chasing toys or hunting anymore. Mostly he just enjoyed his cat retirement by sleeping or surveying his kingdom through the windows. That didn't mean there wasn't a real risk of him getting violent if a strange cat waltzed in through the cat door like he owned the place. Even if, as in Jack's case, he actually did. So, Jack decided to try a more cautious approach. He started forward again, dragging his bag to the sidewalk right in front of his house. Maybe if Rocky recognized the bag, it would help him recognize Jack. He dropped the strap and sat as calmly as he could, hoping Rocky would open his eyes and notice him. After a few minutes, a noisy truck drove past and stirred Rocky from his reverie. Jack raised his paw in a sort of wave and meowed. Rocky's gaze flicked to him briefly, and then away, apparently uninterested. Jack thought about how he had sounded when he meowed. He had actually thought meow and tried to say that, but it came out sounding very little like a cat's actual meow. He pulled the bag forward about 10 feet onto the lawn and tried saying something in human words. "Rocky, it's me." His meow sounded more natural this time, and Rocky looked at him again, but still didn't watch him for long. Had Rocky understood him? Had he even heard him? Jack left the bag where it was and hopped up onto the windowsill, right in front of Rocky. This time, Rocky didn't ignore him, but instead pulled his head back a bit and stared at Jack in surprise, the way a stranger might if Jack sat down close and started talking to him on the bus. "Rocky, I'm Jack. Can you hear me? Do you understand me?" Rocky's pupils widened and his ears turned back in fear. He rose to all fours and backed away from Jack a step or two along the windowsill, still without a sound. This didn't seem to be working. Jack decided to try a different tactic. He jumped down to the lawn and pulled his ID from his bag. He managed to get his driver's license out and hold it in his mouth well enough to jump back up to the windowsill with it. He pressed it against the glass with a paw and said, "This is me, Rocky, that I'm Jack, your friend." He thought his meow sounded less anxious and more calm this time. Rocky looked hard at Jack's photo on his license for a few seconds, then at Jack the cat. He sat down again and stared some more. "Say something, Rocky," Jack pleaded. Instead, Rocky turned away and jumped down from the windowsill. Jack watched him trot across the small living room and out of sight into the kitchen. Was he just going off to eat? Jack tried to get a better view by moving to the right, but all he could see was the first set of cupboards and the toaster on the counter. No Rocky. Then he heard a familiar sound behind him. Meow! Jack turned, and there was Rocky on the welcome mat. He must have come out through the cat flap in the back patio door. He was standing looking up at Jack on the windowsill, expectantly. Jack dropped down cautiously, giving Rocky some space, and dropped his access card onto the concrete of the porch. How should he act? He tried to think of all the nature specials he'd seen about lions. Should he keep his head close to the ground and wait for Rocky to make the first move? Or should he go forward confidently and try to establish himself as dominant? If I want to be able to live and do what I want in my own house, I'd better make sure he knows I'm still the boss around here, thought Jack. So he took a few steps forward with his ears up and his whiskers spread wide. He didn't want to be threatening, but he did want to look confident. Rocky lowered his head a bit in response and made a small meow without opening his mouth much. He certainly didn't seem threatened or threatening. This close to Rocky, Jack realized he was picking up all sorts of new signals he hadn't gotten through the glass of the window. He smelled Rocky very clearly. It was a familiar smell and not a strong one. Rocky had never been a stinky cat, but there was a nuance to the smell that Jack didn't recognize. He couldn't name it, but it made him feel calm and safe and happy, like the smell of his mom's bread in the oven or fresh laundry. And there was another note to it, one that made him feel slightly unsettled, like something was expected of him, like a question being asked. As he and Rocky looked into one another's eyes, Jack felt very strongly that he was somehow receiving Rocky's mood through those smells. "I'm Jack, your friend," Jack tried saying. "We live together. I know I look different, but it's still me. I'm not a stranger, I'm just home from work." It all came out as small cat sounds from his mouth, but he tried to put as much friendly, calm, and affectionate feeling behind the words as he could. And he realized he noticed his own scent changing as he did this. And instantly, Rocky's ears perked up. He stepped forward and sniffed Jack's face closely, then rubbed his face all the way down Jack's side and curved around away from him to face him again. Jack smelled both of their scents mixed now, coming from his own fur. Acting on a hunch, he stepped forward to rub his own face down Rocky's jaw, and noticed his scent coming from Rocky's face as well. Rocky was purring, and Jack felt the same tuna-induced rumble from earlier start within himself. "Wow," said Rocky again, then sat down and began to groom himself. Though he had felt really weird pressing his face into Rocky's like that, Jack felt okay now. Rocky had accepted him at least, whether he recognized him fully as Jack or not. They clearly weren't going to be having rational conversations any time soon, if this was how cat communication worked. But they might be able to understand one another well enough to live together. As with the rest of this experience, he'd just have to learn to make do. And that is the end of Chapter 3. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a good day.